For most of us, press freedom is an abstraction. It's an idea that we're all vaguely aware of, but don't often really stop to consider with any great depth. Even for those of us who work in the industry, it can all feel a bit woolly, a bit vague. A little bit like oxygen, something that we know that we need, we can't operate without, but we only ever really stop to think about when we're at risk of losing it. Well, for me, the vague idea of press freedom on the night of December 28th of 2013 became a very concrete reality. Back then, I was working for Al Jazeera. I was a correspondent. I'd been called to Cairo to cover the Christmas-New Year period. And we were reporting on the unfolding political crisis. The interim government was trying to establish and assert its control over the country after the previous government had been ousted in a military coup 6 months earlier. Now, that government was the Muslim Brotherhood, and its supporters were still in the streets advocating and protesting and demanding the return of the Brotherhood administration. Now, as journalists, we were doing what any responsible reporters should be. We were talking to all of the parties involved in the dispute. Now, the government, the interim government, was also introducing new pieces of national security legislation that in all sorts of ways were defined very broadly, very vaguely. They were defining things like terrorism as anything that threatens the integrity of the state. They were also introducing new laws that criminalised advocating terrorist ideology. Now, for us, that was concerning. It raised a number of red flags, but we weren't too concerned because we took the government at its word when it said that it was committed to defending press freedom. Now, that night, December the 28th, I was in my hotel room. I was getting ready to go out for dinner with an old friend of mine who I hadn't seen for a few years. And there was a knock on the door. It was a little bit unusual. Normally when people had messages for me, they used the telephone. I didn't think too much about it though as I approached the door, and then there was a second, more urgent, more forceful knock. I didn't bother checking the peephole, I simply cracked open the handle. And as I did, it was flung inside as if there was a powerful spring behind it. And the room was flooded with a whole load of men, maybe 8 or 10 of them. And I was forced to the back of the room, and they went through and ransacked everything that I had. They grabbed my notebooks, my computer equipment, my cameras, and so on. And it was a deeply confronting, scary moment, confusing. I had no idea what was going on. The guys in there were all in plain clothes, but they also moved with a professionalism, a discipline that suggested they were more than just a bunch of thugs, which, to be honest with you, I took some comfort in. Eventually, they placed me under arrest and dragged me down to the police cells, where I learned that my 2 colleagues, my Egyptian producer, Baher Mohammed, and my Egyptian-Canadian bureau chief, Mohammed Fahmy, were also under arrest. A few days later, during the interrogation, we learned what our charges were. We'd been accused of aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, of financing a terrorist organisation, of being members of a terrorist organisation, of broadcasting false news with intent to undermine national security, and, yes, of advocating terrorist ideology. Now, when you think about it, those charges are about as serious as you could possibly get, short of actually pulling the pin on a grenade and rolling it into the middle of a crowded room like this. Now, very serious charges indeed. And as the interrogation drew on, we also learned that the authorities had been looking for our sources, our contacts. Now, those are so important for journalists, so fundamental to the work that we do and the role that we play in a democracy, that there are shield laws that protect journalists from actually having to reveal their sources in a court of law. A few weeks later, once the whole interrogation phase was over, we wound up in court, behind a steel cage, wearing blue prison uniforms. And it was at that moment that all of a sudden we came to embody press freedom, that abstract idea I mentioned earlier. People could see and understand what it looks like when press freedom is taken away. So you can understand why it was so confronting for me when I saw those images of the Australian Federal Police raiding the offices and homes of journalists from 2 news organisations here in Australia a few months ago. Let me tell you a little bit about what happened back then. Anika Smethurst, a journalist for News Corp, had 2 years previously uncovered a story about the way in which the government was considering expanding the powers of the Australian Signals Directorate, that's Australia's electronic spy agency, so that they could monitor the communications of ordinary Australians inside Australia. Now, Anika didn't publish anything that actually undermined the operational integrity of the ASD. Instead, what she was doing was exposing a conversation, a private, confidential conversation within government, a classified conversation, and involving a debate that I think should have been public, that we all should have been a part of. And what about the ABC? Well, its journalists had uncovered allegations that Australian special forces were involved in war crimes in Afghanistan. And there too, the journalists weren't exposing anything that could have threatened the operational integrity of the special forces. There was nothing in there that damaged national security. What they were doing was exposing something that I think we all needed to know about, because after all, the special forces are operating in our name, in our defence. Now, I'm drawing the connection with Egypt and Australia not to suggest that Australia is about to become Egypt anytime soon. But here's the thing. The political imperatives which drove the Egyptians to draft loosely worded national security legislation that was then used to silence inconvenient journalism are the same political imperatives that have driven the Australian government to draft loosely worded national security legislation that was then used to silence uncomfortable journalism. In fact, Australia has been so enthusiastic about passing national security laws that since 9/11, Professor George Williams from Sydney University has counted more than 70 pieces of national security legislation that have passed through Australian parliaments, many of which intrude in some way on the civil liberties of ordinary Australians. Now, what does this mean for press freedom? Well, in many cases, what it's done is criminalise what would previously have been considered as legitimate journalism. And it's made it impossible for us to protect our sources. So let me give you a few examples. There's Section 35P of the ASIO Act. Now that section allows the Minister to declare any security operation what's called an SIO, a Special Intelligence Operation. Now that designation itself is top secret. So a journalist who is perhaps investigating, say, a botched ASIO raid, local reports of a botched ASIO raid in which somebody is perhaps killed or wounded or harmed in some way, runs the risk of unwittingly violating the Act and finding themselves in prison for 5 years. The SIO designation was designed for good purpose. It was designed to give ASIO operatives the opportunity to work undercover, to do illegal things in the course of their investigations, such as, say, a narcotics agent carrying drugs to try and open up a drugs ring. But the way it's defined is so broad that it gives the Minister the authority to place that SIO designation over anything that they might want to keep hidden. And by the way, the SIO designation exists in perpetuity, so even investigating the history of ASIO runs the risk of landing you in trouble. What about the data retention legislation? Well, that was sold to us as essential to allow the security services the capacity to monitor and intercept terrorist communications so that they could stop mass casualty attacks. It's really important, the sort of thing that we want. The legislation gives a whole host of government agencies, more than 20 of them, the free access to look at any Australian's metadata without a warrant. Now, the metadata, for those of you who don't know, is not the content of your communications. It isn't the emails that you send or the conversations that you have over the phone. But it is the email addresses that you send, that you communicate with, the telephone numbers you call, the text messages you send, the websites you visit, the locations that you are when you make those communications, and so on. The information is so rich that one former FBI director said that if you have access to metadata, you don't really need to know the contents of the communications to learn what it is that people are up to and what they're planning. Now, last year, we know, according to the Telecommunications Alliance, an industry group, that they received more than 300,000 requests for metadata, more than 1,000 a day. Now, quite apart from what that means for our own privacy and civil liberties, what about journalists? Well, that is the one exception. The authorities still require warrants to investigate journalist metadata, but those hearings are in secret and journalists are never consulted about why it might be important that their stories are protected, that their sources are able to remain anonymous. It's now so serious that news editors are typically telling their journalists that if you do not have secure encrypted communications, then you've got to shut the story down. Except there's also the Telecommunications Amendment Act. Now, this piece of legislation forces any telecommunications worker to help the security services hack into encrypted communications. A journalist simply looking into Australia's foreign affairs, our foreign relations, things as mundane as trade and investment, runs the risk of going foul of the Espionage and Foreign Interference Act. Under that law, any serving or former Commonwealth officer who reveals any information that might be undermining confidence in Australia runs the risk of being imprisoned for 7 years, up to 10 years if they carry a security classification. Witness K, the ASIS agent who revealed that Australian government was bugging the rooms of an East Timorese delegation during sensitive oil negotiations, well, he's just pleaded guilty to espionage charges. The point is that you don't really need to be putting journalists in prison for these laws to have an effect. Our research is showing that a lot of what would have previously been considered as legitimate journalistic inquiry is now being shut down because editors are simply too afraid either of going through the trauma of having to go into court or because they know they cannot afford the costs of defending themselves in court. This is a very big deal for us. But there is a solution here. This being TED, one of the solutions that we have is what we call a Media Freedom Act. Australia doesn't have any constitutional protection for press freedom, or for freedom of speech for that matter. Nothing at all. What we do have is a ruling from the High Court from 1992 in a landmark case in which they said that Australia has a constitutionally mandated system of representative democracy. And because we have that system of representative democracy, it doesn't work unless you're able to communicate freely about political issues. And so there is an implied right of political communication. That's why I think we need a Media Freedom Act to hardwire the idea of press freedom into the very DNA of our Constitution, to do what the First Amendment does in the United States. It effectively restrains legislators from either directly or indirectly passing laws that limit press freedom unnecessarily. And it also acts as a benchmark, as a ruler that the judiciary can use whenever they're adjudicating on cases that involve press freedom. We also think that we need to be amending Australia's national security laws. Now, at the moment, for example, there is a public interest defence that journalists can use whenever they're in court to justify why they're doing the stories that they are and why their sources should remain protected. I think that's a problem because it allows the kinds of raids that we saw the other week. I think that there is a way of making a public interest exception. In other words, we should be forcing the security services to apply for warrants showing in the process that the public interest defence would not apply. We can be reforming whistleblower legislation, which is inconsistent across the states. Our source protection laws, data protection laws. We can be reforming our suppression order system. Overall, what we need to be doing is trying to enshrine in law the fundamental system of transparency and accountability which has made our democracy work. Now, this is key. I am not suggesting that we need to be undoing our national security laws. Absolutely not. I completely understand the need to update our laws to make sure that our agencies have the capacity to adapt to evolving threats. But this is, as I said, about protecting transparency in our system of democracy. The media is the whistle of last resort. At the moment, what's happening is it's portrayed as a trade-off, as a balancing act, as if on the one hand you can have you have national security or you can have press freedom. The more you have of one, the less you have of the other. But I think that's a mistake. You see, if national security is about anything at all, surely it is about protecting, yes, the physical security of ordinary Australians and our infrastructure and our property and so on. But it must also be about protecting the very system of accountability and transparency that has made our democracy one of the most safest, peaceful and prosperous places on the planet. Thank you.